It was supposed to be the jewel in Britain's manufacturing crown, our first homegrown gigafactory, co-financed by the government, turning out electric car batteries from its plant in the northeast, allowing this country to compete with the rest of the world. But when Britishvolt collapsed into administration earlier this year, the dream was left in tatters. Now, in his first TV interview since its implosion, the company's co-founder has told Sky News that the government, and specifically Rishi Sunak, must take much of the blame. There have been all these stories about lots of money, millions of pounds spent on executive salaries, on consultants as well. Lots of money spent on I think a kind of like £2-3 million mansion for executives to use. Yoga lessons as well, remote from Dubai. When you put all of that together, can you see why people feel that, you know, there were question marks over the management and whether there was value for money, given this was taxpayers' money that was potentially going to be going into this company as well?
So you're absolutely right. Taking and breaking them down one by one, I think, is very important. Having a wellness instructor as a preventative measure for people's health, that is economical. To be able to do that virtually for 300 people at a low cost of roughly £2,000-3,000 a month, that is very economical. When you say mansion for millions, that was rented for approximately £100,000 a year. That allowed us to constantly man that house with over 5 to 10 executives up in the northeast. Don't forget, Britishvolt is a company that was born out of COVID. So the team was scattered all over UK. And it was a really, really good team because we had gathered the creme de la creme of UK talent in building the next energy champion of UK PLC.
But a really good team, a mansion, but all for a company that went insolvent.
It went insolvent at the back end of a delayed government grant sign-off, not an intent as it was in January, announced by Number 10. IDAB in between approved it, BASE approved it. It went all the way until end of July, early August, it was signed off. Why was that important from a market sentiment, from an investment sentiment? Because it's an energy-intense process to produce batteries. On top of government grant, we also need changes within the energy policies of UK. It is such a much bigger picture than just Britishvolt, and the energy transition for UK is so much more than Britishvolt. But what a shame that Britishvolt has been that wake-up call. Because let's not forget, Q3, Q4, 3 different prime ministers, 4 different chancellors. Beginning of 2022, if you would say, during 22, UK will have inflation levels close to what we had in 1955 last time around. We will have geopolitical uncertainties in Europe. Last time that happened was 1945 and the Second World War. Interest rates spiking. Nobody had a crystal ball. Timing was of the essence. And unfortunately, Britain hit 38 billion FDI deficit in Q4 2022. So all of this obviously was a contributing factor.
So you've got the economy, the state of the economy.
Yes.
You've got the government and the fact that the government wasn't giving you as much money as you needed, as much money as you were getting from overseas, right?
No, we were getting less money from overseas, but it was the delay from intent to sign off.
So the sign off that Rishi Sunak didn't do until the kind of
Correct.
The last minute. But then that final factor of whether there was mismanagement, do you think that's a kind of legitimate question?
There was no misappropriation of funds because not a single penny was spent on a private jet. 100,000 went to a, as you say, a mansion, but it was a large house. And if you look at the cost of renting a hotel room for that many people during that period of time, it was far more economical to rent a house. The fact that it happened to have a pool that wasn't working for 18 months, by the way, that has nothing to do with it.
Okay, so there's the mansion or the house or whatever one wants to call it. There's many millions of pounds spent on consultants as well at the same time. The concern I think some people within government and many, I imagine, in the public have is just that you were asking for quite a lot of public money, so taxpayers' money, and there are concerns that not all of that money would have been spent in as disciplined a way as they would have liked. Do you think that's fair?
So every single of taxpayer money was going to equipment, was going to the Hamsol facility or the actual gigaplant up in the northeast.
So not to the mansion, not to the consultants?
Definitely not to the mansion, definitely not to the consultants. The drawdown of government money would have come according to milestones and KPIs that were pre-negotiated in 2021. And furthermore, to build a gigafactory is very, very costly because you're talking about a couple of £1 million versus a total capex of £4 billion.
I see. And did you get any government money?
No.
So there was no government money along the way?
No.
It was all private money that, up until that point where it was wound down or it was sold off?
Correct.
When we're talking about lessons from the experience, so there's partly you say it was bad luck. Partly it was bad luck. Partly it was the government wasn't bold enough. Is that a fair kind of characterisation of what you're saying in terms of how much money it was willing to give?
They say it's a race for net zero. A race means that we need to move fast. China has been moving fast for 2 decades now. IPCEI, Important Projects of Common European Interest, was implemented 2015-16, and they started deploying capital already in 17-18 in Europe. In the UK, it took a 12-month due diligence period, first for BEIS and the civil servants. They did a sterling job because it's a novel industry. The civil servants were fantastic. And then it was announced, and then from there it took 6 months of pure bureaucracy for the government grant to come out as a final sign-off. Why is that important? The capital market sentiment, as I've said before, requires government support because in the future we also need changes in policy, changes in energy policies and changes there. As an example, these are energy-intense processes for the financial model to make sense. So it all goes hand in hand. As I've said in the past, this is teamwork, energy transition. Building a gigafactory is not just one man's job. We need another 4 of these gigafactories in the UK. We had an impeccable team in place, 300 strong British minds that was ready for industrialization, that was ready to start commercializing what we had been building in the past 2 years. Don't forget, we've developed for the first time in the UK since we invented the lithium-ion battery. We had created UK IP. People claim that we didn't have a battery. That's not correct. We were producing thousands of batteries that were sold to blue-chip OEMs in Europe. But it was all about timing. If we would have moved a bit faster from government perspective, supported the proposition with a final sign-off when the intent came in January from number 10, we would have caught the funding cycle when FDI in the UK was positive. Instead, it was delayed and we fell into a funding cycle that was negative. We need more money, more funding was required to push this proposition forward.
How do you feel when you think back and when you think of what might have been? Do you feel sad? Do you feel angry?
Devastated. Devastated. We shed blood, sweat and tears into this. The team was so passionate. We had one window of opportunity to build a gigafactory and have that ready by 25. We've spent £70 million on enabling work onto the site in the northeast. Another £30 million on process engineering, on designing it from an energy perspective in order to build a low carbon, sustainable gigafactory proposition. This is where UK shines. The brightest minds had come together for 2.5, 3 years to build that first gigafactory. Instead, we lost that window of opportunity. Now we're 2 years delayed. Earliest we can build a gigafactory by 27. Imagine we already are behind East Asia. We're already behind continental Europe. UK, unfortunately, has lost out or is losing out on a gigafactory economy, which is massive in terms of job creation. On one end, if you look at the Britishvolt proposition, it was creating job in the midst of the pandemic. It was a positive FDI contributor into the country, but unfortunately didn't see that same support from the Conservative government in order to level up the Northeast. Because Northeast wasn't as important for them as maybe other places in this country.
Really,
Britishvolt
you
wasn't...
didn't get the support that you felt you should have got?
Definitely not. At least not from a timing perspective. The civil servants were brilliant. 12 months between January 21 and 22, they did all their due diligences. It was one of the largest civil servant due diligence processes in her, back then, Her Majesty's government's history that Britishvolt went through.
But the point you've said a couple of times is when it got to Downing Street, in particular when it got to number 11, it just ground to a halt, did it?
So number 10 announced in January intent to provide Britishvolt with £100 million.
Right.
Bayes approved and signed off. IDEB approved and signed off. It was supposed to go to number 11 and come back. March, April, May, June, all of July was stuck.
Stuck at number 11.
Correct.
And who was Chancellor at that point?
Rishi Sunak.
Right. So he has to bear some responsibility for what happened if this was a timing thing. If you could have got in earlier,
I think
things would have been different.
I don't think Mr. Sunak would look at it that way. Nor do I want to point the finger at anybody. But what I do know that
but it
there
sounds
was
like the finger keeps coming back to him.
Yeah, but there was a major rivalry going on between Mr. Johnson and Mr. Sunak at that period of time.
But if you're looking back at the one thing that could have swung it,
I think Britishvolt was collateral damage, stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak.
The rivalry between 10 and 11, yes.
So you said you feel devastated about what happened. Do you feel any anger as well and frustration about the nature of how it happened?
Nobody could foresee a two-digit inflation that the country hasn't seen since 1955, rise in interest rates. Nobody could foresee 3 different prime ministers, 4 different chancellors. UK saw a very turbulent time. And for a startup, what is important is that continuous capital injection. And that really halted off. And unfortunately, because of that rivalry, we were hit with a delay, yeah.
Do you understand why some people who were involved in Britishvolt feel anger and frustration themselves?
Yeah.
About having been in a project that, they were very committed to and has emotional investment in, and it didn't come off?
Yeah. I'm personally very, very sad, upset, devastated. The hope of a gigafactory and building a gigafactory, the dream of building a gigafactory in the UK, unfortunately disappeared, vanished into thin air.
And do you think this has done damage to, the hopes of others who want to build these factories in the UK?
Unless UK changes its industrial strategy, we will keep losing out on large-scale projects. Arrival left, the electric Mini left. It's not just Britishvolt. There's a clear lack of industrial strategy, and feels like they're going towards the right direction. I keep hearing rumblings that JLR might come to Somerset. I read something in media that JLR had asked for 500 million. Imagine. Britishvolt couldn't even get 100 million.
Well, they're choosing between Somerset and Spain at the moment.
Yes. So the dreams of having a gigafactory in the UK is definitely there. But then again, giving 500 million to Tata and JLR, how does that help Aston Martin? How does that help Lotus? How does that help other propositions and other OEMs in the UK? At least Britishvolt was targeting to service all of the OEMs, not just one OEM.
Do you worry that when people look back at this period in industrial history, that they'll look at Britishvolt and that name will be associated with failure rather than success?
I don't think it will be, especially when you look backwards. Britishvolt will be associated as a wake-up call for the country. I'm hearing the Labour Party wanting to deploy 20 billion plus for energy transition. That would be fantastic for UK economy as part of reindustrialization that we haven't seen since the Thatcher era in this country. And that comes with investment, that requires investment to bridge that funding gap, which we've seen from Europe and IPCEI, which we've seen with the IRA and 370 billion package in the US.
When you look around the world at different governments and how they are assisting their battery industries, what do you see there, and then what do you see in the UK?
Firstly, speed. They're much more agile. They're much more dynamic.
When did they? Who are you talking about here?
China has been for 2 decades. European Union and the Commission. Northvolt received over 700 million. As I said, Germany as a country gave a private company in Sweden 350 million government guarantee for them to be able to free up cash for their second project in Europe. That's unheard of in modern capital market history. That's unheard of. We've seen the IRA being implemented in US. That's 370 billion package. They're acting much faster. They're deploying each project much, much faster. Coming back to timing again. 12 months of due diligence. Number 10 announces. BEIS approves and signs off. IDAB approves and signs off. It takes another 6 months for number 11 to sign off. I don't see this as efficient.
So too slow, but the size, is the UK ambitious enough on size?
I would say the Labour proposition and proposal is far more closer to what the rest of the world is doing compared to the industrial strategy that we have in place today.
And for those people who look at this and say, why are all these private companies so reliant on government assistance? Couldn't they just survive on their own 2 feet? What's the response to that?
It's a capex heavy exercise. It's an industrial investment. It's an industrial project, large scale industrial project. We need to come at least into the kind of 14, 15, 16 gigawatt hours in order to reach economies of scale for these projects. That comes with a funding requirement of 1.5 billion and above. Why do you have IPCEI implemented in Europe? Important projects of common European interest. In order to bridge that funding gap. What has China been doing for the past 2 decades? They have been bridging that funding gap. It is not possible to set up a gigafactory without any government support.
It's not possible, is it?
Does not make economic sense. However,
doesn't that mean maybe the UK shouldn't be doing it at all?
But it's a necessity as part of the energy transition. There is no energy transition without gigafactories. There is no energy transition without batteries. And
for the car industry?
Oh, for the car industry in particular, as we're moving away from ICE, internal combustion engine, towards this era of EVs and e-mobility, batteries are quintessential in this transition. And we need assistance, and we need to bridge these gaps, just like any other country is doing in the rest of the world.
You've waited quite a while before kind of coming out and talking publicly. Did you just need some time to kind of think about things? You know, a lot of people have heard from other sources about Britishvolt, but why are we hearing from you now, do you think?
So I left the company in August, and once I stepped down, I was no longer the CEO. I was no longer on the board, and I had to respect and allow my colleagues at Britishvolt to work and do what they needed to do. Unfortunately, the team that was left behind, it was a team that was focused on industrialization. It wasn't a team that was focused on how to, centered around managing global recessions, unheard of global recessions. These were teams of engineers. These were teams of engineers that would build a low carbon, sustainable gigafactory proposition, the creme de la creme of UK. They were not politicians, they were not bankers, and they hit the perfect storm of a recession. A multi-layered recession, unheard of, unlike any other recession we've seen in modern capital markets. The 2008 recession was subprime focused. The early 2000 recession was IT bubble focused. This time around, inflation, geopolitical uncertainty that led to an energy crisis, rising interest rates, multi-layered recession.
And is this the first time you've spoken post the collapse of Britishvolt about what happened?
Yes.
Does it feel like cathartic to be talking about it now?
I'm still devastated when I talk about Britishvolt. The team put in blood, sweat and tears. Blood, sweat and tears. The activity levels on emails were amazing, incredible. The HR department used to tell me it's incredible how passionate everybody is about this project. Emails were flying around 2, 3, 4 a.m. every day, 7 days a week. We really, really lost out on the opportunity of building a gigafactory in the UK. Really, unfortunately, lost out on that opportunity. And the 38 billion deficit on FDI that we saw in Q4 2022 is, I think, self-explanatory.
Why do they still matter? Do they still matter? Does it still matter for the UK to be pushing to have more gigafactories in future?
I think UK needs to build not 1, not 2. According to APC, we need to build 4 gigafactories by 2030. Do they still matter? Yes. They're essential for the energy transition. There is no energy transition without batteries. Nor is it enough.
But we couldn't just import them from China, could we?
Rules of origin are being implemented 2027 in Europe. So that means that even if you import a cathode of the battery from China and assemble it on the shores of continental Europe or UK, you would still be hit with a 10% tariff. But let me pose you another question then, Ed, and think about this. If the lithium iron phosphate LFP battery is equivalent to the diesel, especially for the last mile delivery, if the NMC, the high kind of energy density nickel manganese cobalt type batteries are for the kind of sports car industry or the luxury car industry. But that reminds me, in a very basic term, diesel and petrol. Do we want to have full dependency of all of our diesel and petrol to China? Does that not cause an energy security issue for the country?
That's the issue, is it? So it comes down to being able to have that energy independence or the security.
That's why they implemented the rules of origin in the first place, because it's a major, major energy security issue.
If Tata chose Spain rather than the UK, would you be surprised?
I hope they choose the UK. I hope that the government will give them at least £200-300 million. And I hope that the government will actually go in and change legislation and policies around energy and bring the JLR or the Tata facility to the UK. But is that enough though? We have more OEMs besides JLR in the UK. Tata would just be producing for themselves.
So we still need more, even after that.
Who's going to service the Aston Martins of this world? Who's going to service the Lotuses of this world? Even if these are small numbers, but put them all together, what would have happened if Arrival would have stayed? Who would have been supplying Arrival? What about Teva, another fantastic company in the UK? Who would be supplying Teva? We do still have hopes of homegrown gigafactory in terms of AMTI, but that's more niche market. That's more sodium-ion type of batteries. That doesn't go towards the EV side of things. And then become reliant on what? Continental Europe. But continental Europe is seeing a deficit in terms of supply and demand. There are only 7 gigafactories in Europe compared to the 118 in China. We need to build another 10, 15 of them in Europe, but that's going to be all eaten up by domestic demand. And then, on top of that, for true energy transition, for true net zero targets, we also need to buffer our grids as we move towards renewable energy sources. The sun doesn't shine all the time. So we need static and stationary energy storage. Again, batteries. The wind doesn't blow all the time. So again, we need to buffer the grids with stationary and static energy storage. In extension, natural evolution, home wall batteries. Again, we need batteries as part of this energy
All roads
transition.
lead back to batteries.
Always comes back to batteries. There is no energy transition without batteries.
We asked the government for comment about Mr Nadjari's allegations that the Treasury, and in particular Rishi Sunak, delayed the grant money that might have saved Britishvolt for nearly 6 months. A spokesperson said, "These claims are completely untrue. Taxpayer money must always be used responsibly, which is why full due diligence was undertaken before a final grant offer was made. The grant offer, which was welcomed and accepted by the company, included an agreement that funds could only be drawn when agreed milestones are met, such as those on securing private investment. Unfortunately, those conditions were not met, and despite significant engagement from government, a solution was not found." The government remains committed to levelling up across the UK and is actively engaging with companies to secure investments that will ensure the UK remains a world leader in automotive manufacturing. The problem, according to insiders from both camps, is that the Britishvolt experience may have undermined confidence in gigafactories altogether. It might mean government is now more reluctant to put public money into these projects. But without these factories, the fate of Britain's car industry is increasingly under question.